How much do you know about the city of Chevron? It is obviously very important in Jewish history. It's one of our 4 cities. It's the first place Avraham Avinu owned as part of Eretz Yisrael. The question is, why was that the first place? Der Schalt von Eretz Yisrael was am beides befehl übergegangen to Avraham Avinu, the first place within Eretz Yisrael that fell under the ownership and jurisdiction of Avraham Avinu. Is as given in Chevron, was Chevron, as the pasuk tells us, Distem Machpelah Pnei Mamre Chevron, the field with the Machpelah cave that belonged to Mamre in Chevron. Now, even though earlier in the covenant that Eibishter made with Avraham Avinu, the entire Eretz Yisrael was given to Avraham and his descendants. As the pasuk says, that I'm giving you and your descendants this land. Even before that, the Eibishter instructed Avraham Avinu to walk the length and breadth of the land of Israel. Why? Because I'm planning to give it to you. However, there's something unique about Chevron. The actual ownership and verified through a transaction, and specifically in public, in front of the children of Chayei, and everybody who belonged to that city. That is something that happened with regards to the Maras Machpelah, which is in Chevron. From that point on, Chevron and the Maras Machpelah belongs to Avram, his descendants, and all Jews for all of history. It's Am B'nai Yisrael, the Jewish people. As the Medrash tells us about Maras Machpelah, that this is one of 3 locations that really, if people were honest, no nation should have a claim against the Jewish people, to claim that we had stolen this land. The 3 places are Maras Machpelah that we bought, Beis HaMikdash that David HaMelech bought, Ukfurasa Shel Yosef, and the Kfura of Yosef in Shechem, which was given directly to Yosef. Das heißt, in other words, as die beides von Eden befehl auf Eretz Yisrael, hat sich angefangen damit, was Avraham Avinu hat gekauft, Maras Machpelah Kfura Sarah. The process of the Jewish people taking ownership of the land of Israel began when Avraham Avinu took ownership of Maras Machpelah to bury Sarah, which is obviously Chevron. Wer steht in Eben Ezra, as das ist einer von den Teilen, was Nizkira Zois HaParsha. The Eben Ezra says this is one of the reasons why the Torah gives us this information and this detail about the transaction to purchase Chevron, lekayem dvar Hashem leAvram liyos lo nachlo, in order that it shows that David kept his word to Avraham Avinu that he would inherit the land. Now, everything in Torah is specific, so the fact that Chevron is that place is relevant. Anything associated with Torah is absolutely precise. Is moving as dos was the Ershen Nachal von Eden in Eretz Yisrael is in Chevron. That means that if the Eibishter chose that the first part of Eretz Yisrael that the Jews should own is Chevron, is das verbunden mit Niemand Yuchad was Chevron vermogt. That must be linked to the unique element of Chevron, which we'll have to unpack. Und ja Schleimer. In fact, not only does Chevron have something unique, the fact that Chevron is the first part of real estate in Eretz Yisrael that the Jews own, that's why this ownership, or how we came to be the owners of it, is advertised. They know to the entire world. Clear for all periods in history that we can refer back to Chevron, understand not only what happened in terms of Chevron, but what happens in terms of our rights to the whole of Eretz Yisrael. And with this in mind, we can explain the medrash that's mentioned in our parasha, which we'll actually only come back to at the end of the Sikha. From the time was Chevron Kiryas Arba, one of the reasons that Chevron is also called Kiryas Arba, which essentially means the meeting place of 4, is Sho'ela B'Karnos and Geirolis. As the Matnas Kuna explains, it's because this piece of Chevron came to ownership through a goyrel shadalet to 4 different people or groups. Mitchila liYehuda, first Yehuda, v'achakach leKalev. So Shevet Yehuda got it. Then Kalev specifically got it, as the Torah tells us clearly. V'achakach leKehanim, v'achakach leLevim, and then it went to the Kohanim and the Levim. Now the Chayei, was is the nafkemen und the meile, and then was Chevron od gehat dalet beile. Why do we have to know this information? That over history, Chevron had 4 different owners, individuals or groups. And why does that make Chevron great? So special that it had 4 owners. As the mitzvah harausgebracht ha'inyan miyuchad beneged the beinis von Eden of Chevron kidele kamon, must be that embedded in that message is something about why Chevron is so unique to illustrate what it means for the Jewish people to possess Eretz Yisrael and Chevron specifically. Okay, so we're going to make a proposal, then we'll show that the proposal seems a bit weak, and then we'll come back and accept this proposal, which is, as one of the advantages of our ownership of Chevron is the fact, Chevron was one of those cities of refuge assigned for Chas v'Shalom, a person who kills accidentally, and they should go there for refuge. Now, the Rebbe is going to quote something here from the Rogatchover. It's quite an involved concept that the Rogatchover brings up. We're just going to look at it briefly. It says, so the Rogatchover picks up on the nature of the negotiation over this piece of land between Avram Avinu on the one hand and Bnei Ches on the other hand. As Avram, look at the words in the pasuk, and you'll see that Avram Avinu specifically wanted the Ma'aras HaMachpelah to be at the edge of the field that he would purchase. Why? Because when you set up an Ir Miklat, every city obviously has to have a cemetery. The cemetery has to be at the edge of the city. Why did he want it specifically at the edge of the city, says the Rogatchover? He was concerned that at some point in history they might want to relocate those graves. He didn't want the Ma'aras HaMachpelah relocated. But he shouldn't have worried, says the Rogatchover, because look at the pasuk. The Bnei Ches haben geantwortet. The Bnei Ches answered him, you are a prince of God for us. And that has an halachic implication. It wasn't just platitudes to say how much they respect Avram Avinu. The halacha is that a grave assigned to the nasi, the leader, or to the king, can never be exhumed. They can never be moved elsewhere. So you don't have to worry about the location of Ma'aras HaMachpelah. The fact is that it tells us that Chevron is one of the cities of Arei Miklat. Was der Arei Miklat hat man abgegeben zu den Levim. Now the Arei Miklat were also assigned to Shevet Levi to be able to live in, and that's going to be a very big part of what we discuss in the Sikha. Und in der Beides von Levim, if there are gefunden, wenn Meide der Gabe der Beides von ihnen, if there Nachlas. Now when you analyze this, we want Chevron to illustrate us the strength of our ownership of Eretz Yisrael. So when you say Chevron is an Ir Miklat and it belongs to the Levim, there's something about how Levim own land in Israel which is greater than how average people own land in Israel. Now, if you're already thinking, how could Levim own land in Israel? That's a big part of what we're going to discuss. But for now, let's just say that the ownership that Levim have over their properties in Israel has a tremendous advantage over the ownership that regular people have over their properties in Israel. How so? But the din, the halacha is, and the Rambam brings this, as oi de Levim mochus sadam istei areim. If a Levi should sell one of his fields, oi ba'ismin bater achim or one of his homes in the assigned areas where they were supposed to live, ein goylen kaseder hazev ishar b'nei Yisrael. If they want to redeem and essentially get back that field or that house, they don't follow the same procedure as the rest of the nation. What's the procedure for the rest of the nation? If a person sells a field and they now want to redeem it back, they have to wait a minimum of 2 years before attempting to do so. And if you sell a house that's within a walled environment, then you only have the opportunity to redeem it back within the first year. If not, then it stays with the owner until Yovel. All properties return to original owners in Yovel. Whereas for the Levium, the Levium have the rights to be able to sell a field whenever they choose, even right before the Yovel, and they have the rights immediately to redeem them back. And if they sanctify a Sadeh, they can actually get it back from Hektish after Yovel is over. And if they sell a house, they can redeem that house whenever they want, not limited to the 1 year plan for everybody else. Even after many years, and here comes the part that tells you about the strength of their rights to their piece of Eretz Yisrael. They always have the opportunity to redeem, which means they always have jurisdiction over their property. The rest of the nation doesn't have that. Surely that illustrates that their ownership over their pieces of Israel is permanent. Even if currently somebody else has the rights to that property because I sold it to them, or Hektish has the rights to the property because I sanctified it. Even while that happens, the Levi still retains some kind of authority and ownership over the piece of land, never leaves his hands completely. Komtois, which then illustrates as the Bailis de Chevron, that the ownership over this city called Chevron, I'll say it from the Ir Miklat was gehört to the Levim, because it's an Ir Miklat, which belongs to the Levim, gehört to the Levim and an Ofen von Geula as Oilam, that is a permanent ownership that can always be reclaimed and redeemed, and that is indicative of the whole of Eretz Yisrael, so Chevron would be the ideal place to first take ownership of. Now, there may be a very strong argument against this, aber if that's the logic, was Chevron is not Ir Miklat, was abgegeben geworden zu the Levim, what you're saying, the uniqueness of Chevron is it's one of the cities of refuge, which therefore belong to the Levim, is l'chera fakert, then you can argue the exact opposite. Why? Warum gefindt, dass die Beilis von der Levim ist schwacher wie die Beilis von anderen Shvatim sehr nachla. Because if you know enough about this, you'll know that the ownership that a Levi has over land in Israel is apparently a lot weaker than the ownership, so it might be longer term, but it's a weaker ownership than that of regular people. How so? Because the din is, as Kol Shevet Levi Musayin Shlo Yinichol Be'eretz Canaan. Again, the Rambam tells us that the tribe of Levi is prohibited from owning land in Eretz Yisrael. They don't inherit any of Eretz Yisrael. And the fact that they were then allocated 48 cities, 6 of which were cities of refuge already beforehand. And then you add another 42 Levi cities, which also act as cities of refuge. That's not full ownership, but rather, as the pasuk says, Arim Lashavis. These are cities for them to settle in. In other words, they have the right to live there. So that would seem to indicate that they don't have full control and ownership over their land. So which one is it? You're trying to tell me that the greatness of Chevron is that it's a Levi city, and the Levim have permanent ownership of their land, and that's why we want to start the Bailis of Eretz Yisrael there. But they may have permanent ownership relative to the type of ownership they have, which is apparently a limited ownership. So to try and unpack this, we're going to look at an opinion from the Talmud Yerushalmi, compare it to what the Gemara says in Talmud Bavli, and the Rambam who follows the Talmud Bavli. This should give us clarity. Steht in Yerushalmi, as das die Plukte von Tanoim. The Yerushalmi says that's exactly why there is a debate between two Tanoim, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Meir sagt, dass Keanim Levim sein nicht misvade wie du Meisres. So according to Rabbi Meir, when a person completes the donations of all the various tithes that they have to give, they're supposed to come to the Beis HaMikdash and make a declaration, I did what I was supposed to. So according to Rabbi Meir, a Levi doesn't do that. Why? It's because they don't actually own a piece of land. And part of what you have to say in that declaration is, the land that they gave me, they can't say that. Rabbi Yossi whereas Rabbi Yossi says, yes, they do. They're given those cities that are allocated for them. And therefore they can make the declaration. So that's the Mishnah in Ma'aseh Sheni. Comes along the Gemara Yerushalmi and says, as Rabbi Meir halt leveis dira nitnu. Rabbi Meir says, yes, they were given places, but those places were only given to them as homes, not as ownership of land. Not that it's actually something they own. That's actually part of their inheritance. Whereas when Rabbi Yossi held lemachloikas nitnu, Rabbi Yossi says, no, actually they do have the same rights to their piece of land as anybody else. Those cities are given to them as their inheritance, therefore they can say Hashem gave me land, therefore they can make the declaration. In other words, as ledas Rabbi Yossi's view is, the cities, the 48 cities of the Levim, are theirs as a piece of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore, if they then have a permanent hold over that piece of land, that's much stronger than the average Jewish person. And by the way, as a paskin the Rambam, that's what the Rambam holds lehaloche. That even though part of what you have to say in the Vidui Meiser is the land Hashem gave us, nevertheless the Levim say Vidui Meiser, because even though they don't have the same apportioning of land that was given to the other tribes, they didn't get 1/12 of Eretz Yisrael, they have their cities, which helps resolve our issue. Our issue was, sounds like the Levim have a weaker hold over Eretz Yisrael. Well, it turns out that the pieces they have are considered halachically by the Rambam, following Rabbi Yossi's opinion in the Yerushalmi, considered like real land of theirs, and therefore they have land that belongs to them and they have it permanently, the Levim have an advantage. Now you may question, but the Rambam also holds Rabbi, the Rambam tells us if a person has to go to the Ir Miklat, he doesn't pay rent to live there, even though he's living surely in the property of the Levim. Why not? Because so he says that depends which cities you're talking about. If it's Orei Miklat, the original 6 cities that were allocated, the Rotzeach lives there rent-free. Whereas if the murderer lands up living in one of the other 42 cities, then he would pay rent to the Levim. Question is why? So Vasadas Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi says is di machloikes si maila soyschar levim tolo in the pluktana machloikes nitnu adel beis dir nitnu. So the Yerushalmi's approach is the two fall into the same laws. In other words, the question of whether the property is actually their Chelek and Eretz Yisrael like Rabbi Yossi, then you'd have to pay them rent. If it's just that it was given to them as housing, like Rabbi Meir, then you don't pay them rent for living in their cities. That's how the Yerushalmi would interpret it. Was davon ist mashmas, ja migrisch welche belangen zu den Levim seinen das Ledasser am bloisdim and Beis Ir, which would give the impression that the Rambam's telling us you only pay rent in the 42 cities. That would sound like the Rambam saying only the 42 cities really belong to the Levim, and therefore you have to pay them. Not the original 6 cities which were made as Arei Miklat, because if they belonged to the Levim for real, you'd have to pay them rent to be living there. Was Hovdul Miklat on their Farazans, they could have been a das, bein shaloi das, and the logic there would be these are 6 cities where their primary purpose is to be refuge for murderers. Therefore, they work, like it or not, whether you're conscious of it or not, whether you welcome them or not. Whereas the other 42 cities, there has to be intention to go to the city of refuge, to be accepted into the city of refuge, and then the city of refuge works for you. That is if you take the approach of the Talmud Yerushalmi. But we typically paskin like the Talmud Bavli. Let's see what the Talmud Bavli says. In the Talmud Bavli, it does not seem to draw the same distinction that the Yerushalmi draws. Warum vom Bavli kommt tois, as das, was darf nicht mal sein Schar zum Levi, in die Sheishar Miklat. When the Talmud Bavli discusses the idea that when a murderer goes to one of the 6 cities of refuge, he is exempt from paying rent, says, is nicht weil es fällt in der Beiles von der Levim auf die Stadt, the Gemara doesn't suggest that it's because the Levim don't really own the land and they're just given a housing project on the land, therefore you owe them no rent. Rather, the Talmud Bavli says something very clear. Now, das is adin meyuchad. It's a special halacha that applies to Sheish Arei Miklat. Wie die Gemara sagt. The Gemara says it clearly. As we learned up from Pasuk, the Pasuk says, "V'aya lochem he'arim leMiklat." These cities are yours. They're yours for refuge. Says the Gemara, "Lochem means l'chol tzarcheichem." Whatever you need, it's available to you. In other words, the Torah defined these as cities that you have the free right to, as opposed to a rental right to. And it would appear that the Rambam follows the same approach. From the fact that the Rambam doesn't get into all kinds of detail implies that the Rambam goes with the same approach. As the Bailos von der Levim auf die Arei Miklat und Shar Orei Levim hat demselben Geder. It would seem that the Rambam is not distinguishing between what kind of ownership the Levim have in those 6 Arei Miklat cities or the other 42 secondary Arei Miklat cities, for lack of a better term. Because what does he say? Because he says that the Torah requires us to give cities for the Levim to live in. Which cities are they? Sheisharei Miklat, the original 6 cities of refuge, and the additional 42 cities. And the Rambam says something we haven't yet spoken about. When we add further Arei Miklat as predicted in the Torah when Mashiach will come, then I call the Levim. All of those cities will also belong to the Levim. So it's implied from the way the Rambam puts this that any city which the Levim live in, they have the same ownership of their property in that city, whether it's the original 6 Arei Miklat or subsequent Arei Miklat. And so this whole idea that perhaps the Levim have a weaker hold over the land that they're given in Eretz Yisrael is inaccurate. So there's the greatness of Chevron. It's a land of Levim. Levim actually have a real right to their land, and they have so permanently. Can take it a step further. In Gemara lernt man up from Vasamtin Chomokim Gomer. So the Gemara says, the pasuk says, you, speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, should make for them, these potential murderers, a place where they'll run and have refuge. Says the Gemara, Vasamtin Chobechayecha. This means that the Eibush is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to make a place for them while you're still alive. In other words, Arei Miklat, not in Eretz Yisrael. Mokoim, and the place should be what? Mim Koimcha, part of your place. In other words, from the Machne Levia. Asher Yonus Shama, and there, that's where the potential murderer is going to run. Melamed, says the Gemara, we learn from here, Shoyusom Maglin Bamidbar, that even in the Midbar, there was the mechanism of the Arei Miklat. And Leheichon Maglin, where did they go to their Arei Miklat? LeMachne Levia, to the camp of the Levim. That tells you it's not just incidental that Levim live in Arei Miklat. It's telling us that it's fundamental, that there's something about Arei Miklat and Levim that go together. In fact, because, as we'll see in a moment, because it's territory of the Levim, therefore they are Arei Miklat. Rashi picks up what the Gemara is saying, that the place you allocate as the Arei Miklat should be from your place, the Machne Levia. Says Rashi, that means that it's the camp of the Levim which creates refuge. Va'af Arei Miklat you Arei Levia. And listen to the language, even cities of refuge, they have to be Levi cities. Not Levim live in cities of refuge. Cities of refuge have to be Levi cities. From Peshrashis to Chere Mashma, that implies as also it's not just that there happen to be Levim in Arei Miklat, but rather that because these are places of Levim, therefore they create refuge. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because of who the Levim are and the kind of atmosphere that they create, which is healthy for the Rotzeach. Now, it would be a terrible stretch to think that Rashi is saying, I'm only talking about the other 42 cities, not the original 6 that were allocated as Arei Miklat. On seine Kohelet, though the Favas was given to the Levim, and saying, those 42 cities become cities of refuge because they're given to the Levim. Because if Rashi did intend that, he should have used language that said something along the lines of, and in addition to the Arei Miklat, also Levim cities are refuge. From Pashtas the Shoina, but rather the language that he chooses. And even the cities of refuge should be Levi cities, is mashma that implies Hasret be'ikav and Deshesh Arei Miklat, that he's talking about the Arei Miklat, because that's the language. Arei Miklat have to be Levi cities. Das heißt, in other words, the fact that the 6 cities of refuge were allocated for Levim to live in is that's not just an incidental law about who gets those cities when there are no murderers. As if to say, in addition to the fact that they function as cities of refuge, is given to the Levim, they also should be given as housing for the Levim. It's actually foundational to how Arei Miklat works. The fact that they are or they will be cities of Levim, that gives it the capacity to become a place of refuge. In other words, being a city of Levim creates the possibility of refuge for somebody who's on the run. Das heißt, in other words, when we look at these original 6 cities of refuge, there are 2 elements to them. One is they are cities of refuge. Therefore, they create a safe space for a person on the run. That's what they were assigned for. And therefore, because they're allocated for that purpose, they work, whether you're aware or not aware of their purpose. But there's a step prior to that, which is base. The second thing we're going to identify is the reason that they create immunity is because they are cities of Levim. So you'll say, well, why do I need both? If you tell me that it's a Levi city and therefore it covers people and protects people, why do you also have to tell me that they were allocated as cities of refuge? So there's actually a practical difference once you pick this out. Let's say that one of the the prerequisites in order to have a city of refuge is missing. Kamoi. For example, the halacha is that Arei Miklat only kick in when all 6 of them are functional. So now if you've only got 3 of them functional, there's really no concept of an Ir Miklat. But that means that they are not functional as automatic refuge, but they still function as cities of Leviim, which can have intentional refuge. And as you plan to go there to protect yourself, it works. And this is clear from the chronology of how the Torah tells us about it in Parshas Maseh, which is clearly the Rebbe's Chiddush. First, the Torah describes how we have to give the Leviim places to live. And which are those cities, says the Torah. So first, you have to give the cities to the Leviim. That's point 1. Then point 2, identify what the cities are, and it tells us tells us which cities they are, the 6 Arei Miklat, and then the other 42 cities added to that. Only later does the Torah even tell us the whole concept of the Ir Miklat and how it works. That says, in other words, in other words, the Torah is illustrating that even before there is the legal application of a city of refuge, there have to be cities of Leviim. And as I state before, the Sefer HaChinuch, as I alluded to before, says this clearly. He explains why it is that the Arei Miklat work, why they provide refuge. So the Sefer HaChinuch says some of the Leviim cities were allocated for cities of refuge, and inevitably all of them became that. Why is that? Because of the greatness of the Leviim, and their capacity to be able to be impactful on other people, and their greatness. That's why their territory was selected more than the territory of any other Shevet to be the place for people who are trying to escape the Goel Hadam. Hopefully that holy environment will influence them and atone for them, because it's the Kedusha Fun de Levim, it's the holiness of the Levim. In other words, we now understand that even the 6 cities we always identify as Arei Miklat, they are cities of Levim, and that's actually why they're Arei Miklat. Which implies that even those 6 cities were given into the territory, the ownership, the Balabatishkeit of the Levium. And that's what gave them the capacity to become refuge. Now, all of this information is there to help us understand why Chevron is the first place that Avraham Avinu has to own. But before we get there, there's a very obvious question. With this information, that the Leviim really did have true ownership over their pieces of land, and permanently so, and that brought Kedusha to the place, and that brought the capacity for refuge to the place, well then we have another question. And this question is almost the exact opposite of where we began. Seeing as those cities were handed to the Leviim as true owned territory, so why then does the Torah use what seems to be a misleading term? These cities were given to them to dwell rather than to own. Shloimar debir bozeh. This expression is as follows: 2 components. The fact that these territories belong to the Leviim, these cities belong to the Leviim, is aleph. First of all, you read the pasuk; it says you have to give them cities. So that implies that every Shevet gave land of their own to the Leviim. Und der Fall gewinnt man nach Shini Ikri, was dem Chesir ist angewinnt, mefuza benachlas kama v'chama noch kol hashvatim. That's why you find something really surprising, that the cities of the Leviim were spread throughout all of the other territories of the other Shvatim. Why? Because each of the Shvatim had to donate land in order to have those cities. So that's what gives them ownership. Number 2, Beis, es abayis klolis von dem klolis ha-shevet. Also, the Shevet, as a Shevet, owns these 48 cities. It was given to them as an allocation of cities for the Shevet Levi. as is Zayin Norif LeShebbos. But each individual Levi actually doesn't own his home. He's purely a tenant in his own home in a piece of land that belongs to his Shevet. Was, das ist eine von den Biurim in dem, was der Seder, wie die Olim sind angekommen zu den Levim, ist given, and that would explain the order in which these cities came to the Levim. The Torah tells us clearly that the other Shvatim had to give them cities in which to live. In other words, it first had to belong to the to the rest of the Shvatim. And they had to hand it over to the Levim, showing the Levim as individuals don't get to own this property. Now with all of this information, let's go back to how we began the conversation. The move to from Medrash, Chevron, and we can look at this unusual Medrash that highlights the fact that Chevron was apportioned to 4 different owners at different times through the process of Goyal. Why is that relevant? Chevron is not given an asina klolis from Bnei Yisrael to Shevet Levi. We've already identified that the cities that belong to the Levim were given generically by the Jewish people to the Levim. Chevron was given specifically. It's not just part of a general allocation of land to Shevet Levi. Now Chevron is angekommen to Shevet Levi von Koleven. But specifically, look at the order. Yehuda to Kolev, Kolev to the Kohanim and the Levim. Why is it relevant that Kolev specifically as an individual is the one who's giving them this territory rather than the broader concept of 48 cities given by the Jews en masse? Das heißt, nachdem es ist Haribo von Baalis Klolis from Shevet Yehuda to the Baalis Protis from Kolev, because it's telling us there is Shevet Yehuda who owned an area of which Chevron was part. Then Chevron was given to an individual to Kolev, and then from that individual it goes to the Levim. That's why the Medrash says it went up, it was elevated through this process of transmission from Yehuda to Kolev, Kolev to the Kohanim and Levim. Das says in demselben Eifem, es ist given die Baalis betchila Yehuda ulu Kolev, a Baalis Protis. It's implying in the same way as Yehuda and then Kolev had personal ownership over Chevron. And Derech says das something given to the Levim in a similar way. It was given to the Levim to have personal ownership. Not personal ownership necessarily of their homes. Das heißt, dass in Chevron haben even Oicha Baalis Protis, but the fact is that the Levim, unlike everywhere else where they don't have any personal connection to their property, here in Chevron they do. So Chevron is a stand-alone from the rest of the Achuzah, of the Nachal of the Levim. The Baldas, the Shachas from our Levim to the Levim, is in an Eifem from Geulas Olam Kanal Sif Beis. Now, seeing as we know that any piece of land that the Levim own is forever, kommt euch as the Nitzchus from the Baalis from the Levim of Chevron, that implies that the ownership, the permanent ownership the Levim have over Chevron is Mervi and Allah under Chelek Eretz Yisrael is a greater and more powerful ownership than any other piece of Eretz Yisrael, whether owned by the Shvatim who got their Chelek, or whether owned by the Levim who were given land on which to live. So the advantage of Chevron over anywhere else is the advantage of Levim over anywhere else. It's a permanent, anytime you wish you can get it back kind of ownership. And based beyond that, but it gets under our Levim, but Chevron has an advantage over any other land owned by the Levim, because any other land owned by the Levim, they don't have personal ownership. Chevron they do. Now, what does this all mean? The deeper meaning is this: the deeper reason why Arei Mikrat have to belong to the Levim is similar to what the Sefer HaChinuch said, because we want to create an environment that protects and atones for the Horeg Nefesh Bishgaga, for the inadvertent murderer. Now, when a person kills another person, it affects 2 major areas of their life and their spirituality. The Chet von Horeg Nefesh is a koful. The sin of killing is a double sin. The Chetu period bein Adam lamokim, it creates lack, or it creates separation between the person and the Eibishter, and bein Adam lachaveri, between one person and the next. So the only way to fix this, put this back together with a separation, to create connection again, you need Levim for that. Why? Remember why Rachel called her son Levi? Why Leah called her son Levi? Because now my husband will accompany me. What does that mean? Coming together. It's an implying it implies a connection, and even a brand new connection. Ha'pa'am yilaveh. Now he will accompany me. Something we didn't expect. V'chibur creates bonding. Heifech inyan ha'pirud. The opposite of separation, which is what murder does. Is in Yonim Shel HaLeviim, and that's exactly what the Leviim do. They bring together the two things that murder separates. Firstly, Leviim are separated from the rest of the community to be on the Eibishter's payroll, to be serving the Eibishter. And then Yonam is, and that's not only in the Beis HaMikdash, they have other responsibilities. The Rabbi, to teach the community the right way to follow what the Eibishter wants. And the reason they can do that is because they are so closely connected to Hashem. They're considered the Eibishter's portion. That's one of the reasons they don't get a portion in Eretz Yisrael. So because they're so connected to the Eibishter, they have the capacity to be the antidote to the separation between someone and the Eibishter that murder caused. The person who created such a chasm between themselves and Hashem can now reconcile. Second of all, Beis is their avodah v'yilavu alech v'yishor sucha. Their avodah is also they should accompany the kohanim and service the kohanim. That represents Jewish unity. Besides the obvious that if they're teaching everybody and guiding everybody how to live as Jews, that's obviously an issue of Jewish unity. But here they're accompanying the Kohanim, so they're helping them, and they're representing the Jewish people, so they're helping them. They create this unity in the Jewish people. And that's why the cities of Leviim are the place you can heal and mend the separation caused by such a dramatic incident like killing somebody else, God forbid. Das is inyan b'chol arei miklat, and that capacity to repair the damage of murder applies in every city of refuge. In Chevron is the inyan hisachtos mit noch mehr adgosha. In Chevron, the unity element is highlighted much more. Warum dort seine doch kavodi obviously Moshe kol bnei Yisrael, because who's in Chevron? Our ancestors, our fathers and mothers. Und der Rebbe again ruf titfilas al der Chevron. That's why all of our tefillas ascend to Shemaim via Chevron. Und tefillah vet hongrer Chevron mitzad ha'yischabros mid hamidas chagas. And in Chassidus we sometimes refer to davening as Chevron because it unites the primary midas of love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, etc. So Chevron is a place that represents Jewish unity because all of us together share these ancestors, and unity between us and Hashem because this is a place of connection for us. And therefore Chevron is a place that can heal the breach that happens when a person chas v'shalom takes another life. And because the Avos Imois who are buried there are the Avos Imois for every single Jewish person, is durch dem Chibur from the Avos Imois from Klal Yisrael biyachad, by having all of the Avos Imois in a single place, that brings together all of their descendants, which is us. And through that, you have to that creates the healing and the atonement for the sin of separation between people that is caused by Hirag Nefesh. Is if I feel as and the capacity to bring unity is so obvious in this environment, it's reflected in the name, and we know that the name that is given by Torah to something is the essence of what that thing is. And the name Chevron comes from the word Chibur of unity and bringing together. And Ritz Hashem, in the schus of our unity, we should be zeicher to the ultimate unity with Mashiach right now.